Over the last handful of weeks, I have been putting out videos walking you through the questions that you need to answer when laying out your story for a job interview. As a former senior executive from Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, I've started companies, I've sold companies, I've kind of done it all. I am oftentimes a pretty good facsimile for the person who's on the other side of the table, or I guess the camera now that we're doing video interviews, for someone who is making a hiring decision about you. And it's important to understand how people like me interpret what you're saying in your interview and determining whether or not you get the job. Another common question I get all the time is, well, how long do my stories need to be, or how do I even write my stories to make them effective? This video is going to share with you all of that, and I'm going to do it using my own resume. There were 3 previous videos, one for the situation task, one for the action, one for the result. And this is all part of the STAR format, which many people use in their interview process as a way to evaluate your answers. I like the STAR format because not only is it something that many people understand, but it also forces linear storytelling format, which is super important to help me, the interviewer, walk through and understand what it is you're trying to tell me. One of the ways that you can make things easier for, again, me, the interviewer, is to ensure that we utilize the time effectively. One of the ways you can do that is to communicate to me to help me understand better what it is that you did so that I can understand whether or not you can do that job here and do it well. Because remember, the question that I, as the interviewer, am trying to answer for myself and for everyone else in the interview loop is, can you do the role at this level, at this company, and excel? If the answer is yes to all of those, then obviously we're going to hire you, but a no certainly hurts your chances. In the previous videos, I walked you through the 5 questions per segment, situation, task, action, result, that you should probably answer when delivering your answer in a job interview. Now, are these hard and fast and set in stone? No. Are they a great starting point for you to help you with how do I do my stories better? Yeah, they are. So what are the steps to a good story in your job interview? Well, number 1, start with your resume bullet. Everyone says, I don't know how many stories I'm supposed to have. How many should I have? I don't know where I should start with my stories. The most canonical version of you, your resume that you've sent around to every company you're trying to get hired, has all of the information. That plus any previous performance reviews that you have is a treasure trove for stories for your interviews. So for me, we're going to start with a bullet from my resume. 2, align your story, this bullet, to at least one leadership principle. Now, for me, when I was doing my analysis and I was preparing for my jobs when I was off leaving Amazon, I basically aligned it to 1 for sure, but up to 3, right? Because any story that I'm going to pull off my resume or from a previous performance review is likely to map to at least 1 story, but probably more than 1. And so that's okay. But when I'm laying out my stories, I want to map my bullet to at least 1, but multiple leadership principles. Now, for those of you who aren't interviewing Amazon and you're wondering what are these leadership principles, you can do a search on Google for Amazon leadership principles. The reason I use them is because they are a great categorization framework for delivering feedback, not just to candidates, but about myself and how I share stories and how people think about the roles that they're trying to hire for, because different leadership principles apply differently to different roles. That's just what I do here. It makes it really, really easy to prepare. So again, align to at least 1 leadership principle. 3, now that you've got your story slug line ready to go, you've mapped it to at least 1 leadership principle, try to think of at least 1 question that this will map to. This is going to help guide your thinking as you lay out your answer for your story development. But this is a North Star kind of start with the end in mind situation, which is think of at least 1 question that this might map to. And finally, do the FAQ exercise, which is basically what those previous 3 videos laid out. What are the questions? Lay them out. Let's answer them. So what does this look like in practice for my interview? Well, let's start with the resume bullet. Improved Microsoft to a credible 3rd mobile developer ecosystem in the first year of Windows Phone 7 availability. That's the line from my resume. Align this to at least 1 leadership principle. Well, for this one, I can align it to multiple, but for this one and for the purpose of this video, we're going to focus on dive deep. And finally, my North Star question. Well, a common question that people like to ask in interviews is, tell me about a time where you considerably exceeded expectations. Now, I want to be very clear. When you do this in an interview, you shouldn't seem like you're reading. I didn't memorize all this. I wanted to get this video out. So I'm going to read from what I wrote down, but this is the exercise you need to go through. If you've watched any of my videos, write out the FAQ questions. Make sure you kind of get your story straight with just the questions, then fill in the blanks. 1 to 4 or 5 sentences max per. That's what you should aim for. Did I fully edit this down and trim it down to the 4 or 5 sentences? In most cases, yes, but in all cases, no. So don't ding me for that. But I'm going to read this from the screen because I didn't commit this to memory. I'm not doing a job interview. I want you to see what this is going to feel like coming from someone who's a C-level candidate, could be, what they would do as preparation for their interview. What is the problem you're trying to solve? This story is from 2010, and the core issue facing the team was that Apple and Google had a firm grip on the number 1 and number 2 positions for mobile app developer ecosystem. In my role as Senior Director of Windows Phone Developer Platform, I was primarily responsible for our breadth developers and applications. I had a counterpart that was responsible for the depth apps. At a time, it was apps like Angry Birds, WhatsApp, Facebook. While those apps mattered, we knew that a key selling point at point of sale for phones was number of apps available in the marketplace. Achieving the result would be multi-year effort against BlackBerry, Samsung, and some other mobile OSs which were present at the time. Who was the customer for whom you were solving this problem? We had a somewhat complex market structure. Microsoft had a rich history of developer support, but our move to consumer mobile was lagged by too many years, and our developer ecosystem was skeptical we could build something customers would want. The end consumers were inundated with Apple commercials for the iPhone and Android phones for various manufacturers like Samsung, LG, etc. Finally, the real marketing dollars were being spent by the carriers who were interested in selling handsets and data plans. Customers were app crazy, and apps sold phones. Why is this important to solve now? Why hasn't it been solved before? Given the sizable investment Microsoft was making in the mobile space and the recognition of the importance of the app ecosystem, the senior leadership team decided to invest heavily in building out a team with this singular focus of getting apps on the phone. Given my work to date at the company in the .NET and Azure ecosystem, I was tapped for the breadth developer role. Why were we best positioned to solve this problem? We knew that our core competencies that would separate ourselves from Apple and Google was our legacy of support of the developer ecosystem and the history of developers making money on our platform. We also knew that we had the best developer tools available and the best developer support. What negative outcomes were we avoiding if we were prioritizing this problem? If we didn't do this, we knew that we would be irrelevant in what many were seeing as a replacement to the PC for personal computing. So if all of that was clear, I'm happy to move on to what we did, or if you need some more details, just let me know. Okay. So that's just the situation and task. But did you see what I did there? It's all of those sentences would come together in what I would outlay for my setup for the situation and task facing us for tell me about a time when you over-delivered, considerably exceeded expectations. Next up, we have the action section. The first question is, what course of action did you take? There were 2 actions that we knew we could take to make rapid progress on achieving this goal. The first was to leverage our worldwide evangelist network. Microsoft had a division allocated to developer evangelists. These people were allocated by platform, and we knew we had a narrow window to recruit the very best with the very shiny new thing. We also embarked on a very unique outreach campaign where I was nearly universally available to all of our developers via email, phone calls, Twitter, whatever, to get them excited about the platform. I even changed my email to thephone@microsoft.com and would put my phone number in every public speaking slide deck that I did. Why did you settle on this course of action? We had to take this course of action because we were coming from behind and the other 2 platforms were accelerating their efforts. They were really hyping the stories of overnight app millionaires. What counsel from other team members, employees, or outside information did you seek? You know what? This question is not really relevant, and it's one that I would skip. Like I said, these questions aren't hard and fast, but they're a good starting point. What alternatives did you consider and reject? One thing that we looked at was whether or not it was worth it to spend marketing dollars on a web-based campaign to woo developers. At the end of the day, we knew that we had many communications channels available to us with a massive entrenched developer base, and we wanted to move on that immediately. One change we had made over time, however, was in response to our understanding of that a lot of the dream building for app builders was happening at the student level. So for year 2, we shifted one of our best people to focus on student-based apps. This turned out very well for us. Finally, how were you going to know if you were being successful? We ultimately were measuring success by a leading metric of downloads of the SDK and a trailing metric of apps submitted to the store. We were very aggressive with the former, utilizing the country managers and resources to drive evangelism efforts. And then I would conclude with a bridging statement of, hopefully this was pretty clear as to what we did and why. Would you like me to move on to the outcomes and talk about the results, or do you need more details? And now we move on to the results section. And, listen, if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I talk about this again and again and again. Metrics matter. Data matters. Leverage them where you can. Make sure you insert them in your stories. What was the outcome? We tracked downloads by the country level. We overachieved in year 1 by about 160%. As for apps, we had targeted 25,000 apps in the first year and 100,000 net new apps in the second year. These were astronomical numbers to us at the outset, but we exceeded our expectation in year 1 by 10%, in year 2 by 60% of target. We passed BlackBerry for number 3 position ahead of their ultimate folding, which was unfortunate for them, and we didn't know it was going to happen, but that was the number 3 player in the market, and that's who we targeted. What were your performance metrics and what were the outcomes? Well, we already discussed that, so we'll move on. How did this outcome measure against the estimations you put in place in the initiation of work and the timeline projected? Again, already discussed. What frameworks or guardrails are in place for monitoring the results over time? Well, I talked a little bit about how what we were measuring as a lagging indicator and a leading indicator, so that's already been discussed. What could you have done if you had double the resources to attack the problem? Additional resources could have helped with getting more breadth apps, but we knew that the major headwinds that we were facing at the point of sale had to do with the depth apps. We didn't have Instagram for a long time, as an example. This caused the sales associates in, say, an AT&T store to trash our platform. This was part of the reasoning for the Nokia acquisition. Part of the allocation of funds from that acquisition was to really dump money into signing up developers and getting first-party exclusive handsets, thus Nokia, to overcome the carrier retail issues. Now, here's a question that I would add if I was kind of going through my FAQ and realized this is probably something I would want to ask myself if I was interviewing myself. So let me go ahead and add this to my FAQ since I already said 2 or 3 that I already answered. So here's what I'm going to add in. Looking back, do you think you were successful? Well, this is a good example of winning the battle but losing the war. We had too many headwinds from too many directions to overcome the lead that both Apple and Google had, but the lack of support from the carriers and the lack of the exclusives on the Prime handsets really hurt us in the marketplace. This is a lesser understood challenge, and oftentimes it's suggested that we lost because of no apps. It's just not that simple. Now, another topic that I like to cover out on in the videos is that little something extra, right? You've got the STAR format, and that's great, but if you're driving this conversation forward, you have the ability to continue driving it forward and make yourself look great at the same time, which is why I talk about the STAR-LITE format, not just the STAR format. The L, the I, the T, and the E stand for learning, insight, teaching, and an example. Learning is, what did I learn? What am I going to carry forward and use in future roles? Insight is, how did we come to that idea? How did that come up? How did we solve the problem? Whatever, but what was the key insight? Teaching, what did the organization get taught? What could I teach the organization that continues to be used there today, even though I'm moving on? And obviously examples, what is the example of that? So in this case, I'm going to continue driving the story forward after having delivered my STAR format by saying something like, I talked a little bit about the metrics that we used for success, but because of time constraints, I really didn't talk about how we almost got it wrong. We actually learned something pretty critical early on in the process that dramatically shifted our outlook. I'd be happy to share that if you're interested. Now, what did I do there? Well, I'm going to assume they're going to say yes. Why? Because this is a great hook. This is a great hook. I've kind of thrown it out there. I've said, hey, there's this really interesting thing. I'd love to talk about it. What interviewer isn't going to take that freebie question? So I've laid the bait. I've thrown it out there. I already know the answer because I've prepared for it, and I'm going to continue driving the conversation forward, demonstrating that I'm a pretty competent person at what I do. So I lay that out there, and let's pretend the interviewer says, yeah, I want to hear more about that. What would I have said? Well, we thought that the number of developers was the right metric, and if we could just make enough noise about how great our tools were, Visual Studio, based on a very easy to program platform, Silverlight, and that we had so many more developers in Apple or Google that that would be enough to get interest from all the developers. It wasn't until some of us on the team went into the retail locations well ahead of launch to have the salespeople sell us on iOS or Android, and at that point we realized how much they were pushing app count and number, and even sharing stories about how some random app, Twism comes to mind, being built by a kid who made a ton of money. We needed to manufacture stars, and that meant we needed to start getting the outright numbers up, but also focusing on the total number of apps being developed in the ecosystem and really focusing energy on that and not just talking about how big our developer ecosystem was. It was no longer about we have the biggest ecosystem. It was who's making money. And that was something we didn't understand at the outset, and it really changed the way we thought about our task in front of us and how we went about solving it. That is how I, as someone who would probably be targeting a chief product officer, CEO, COO type level role, but looking back on my career, if I was going to go in and do a set of interviews, how I would prepare using the STAR format. I laid out, pulled a bullet from my resume. That was my starting point. I assigned it to at least one leadership principle, in this case, dive deep. I then said, okay, what question would I want to be talking about in this? In this particular instance, it was about considerably exceeding expectations. That same story could probably be used for a variety of other leadership principles, but in this specific instance, I targeted on dive deep, and I laid out the question as considerably exceeded expectations. And then from there, I broke it down. Situation, task, action, result. Each one had a set of FAQ questions. I eventually narrowed on the ones that I wanted to answer, which tell the story that I want to tell. Generally, you're going to want to keep this to like 6 to 8. There's no hard and fast rule, but that helps constrain the amount of time that you're talking. And once I had that, write out my answers. And the answers then are, kind of 1 to 4 sentences. You can go long, it's fine, but don't go too long because you don't want paragraphs of text that you're trying to memorize. What you want is a conversational, I'm telling you a cool story. I'm walking you through how the protagonist in the story, this is my role, this is what I was doing, this is what I was responsible for, these are the obstacles I had to overcome, and here's what happened. But walking through all of the questions that a smart interviewer is likely to ask you. And you know what these questions are. Why? Because in talking about this, you probably talked about it in a performance review. Probably. If it's on your resume, it's probably in a performance review, which means you had to defend it to your boss and their boss. In some cases, you even had to write it out because some companies have long form reviews. If you've done that work, you know what questions you need to answer. These are the starting point questions. There will be others. It's not hard and fast. These are the ones you have to answer, but this is a great starting point for crafting great stories and sounding like, well, one, you know what you're doing, but two, you're effectively communicating past experiences so you can land your dream job.